Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name's Laurie. First of all, I just want to give you some forewarning. The topic has changed a little bit since the one that you saw in the program. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about innovation and a new way of looking at risk profiling for transportation projects as opposed to projects in general. So if you had an expectation of the original abstract and need to run off or anything like that, otherwise you'll find that there is quite a bit of overlap between what I had in the original abstract and what we're going to go through today. So I guess just to set the scene, why do we have project controls? I think project controls are really important, and when we think of the quote, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, it's the one that's the most adaptable to change. That stands true more than anything today with innovation and disruption. And of course, projects are the way that we implement change, making project controls and risk management particularly important. So I was very fortunate. I'm just going to share a story before I get into some of the technical detail, to have had an extraordinary experience around this time last year. I was involved with a group called AACE International, who are a group that are involved with advancing cost engineering and risk engineering globally. And I had a role within Asia Pacific, and the Minister for Statistics and Program Implementation in India had called a number of us together. So we had experts from the US, 2 from Saudi Arabia, 1 from Qatar, myself from Australia, all coming to come and have a collaboration. And I didn't really know what to expect. It wasn't anything that I'd ever experienced in my career before. And it was really quite extraordinary. The sceptical side of me, I guess my first instinct was that there was going to be some political agenda or a election coming up, that something needed to be finished early or pulled in or something like that. But what actually happened was completely different. So we met with this man, and he sat down and was extremely humble and spent a couple of hours explaining all of the problems that he had on infrastructure projects over there, in particular transportation infrastructure projects. He described the problem with procurement processes, land procurement processes, performance management and delays, and all of that sort of thing. And we spent a good half an hour, and his absolute 100% intention was to deliver projects more effectively so that community benefits could be realised better. And it's really interesting when you go to a place like India. It's so intense. Every one of your senses is getting stimulated overload. The noise, the visual aspect of it, the temples, the colourful temples, and all of that sort of thing, and of course the poverty as well. And what I really enjoyed about this experience is it brought me back to ground zero and helped reconnect me with why we do projects and why we do things like project controls, is so that we can actually help and get better outcomes for humanity. So this minister, his intention was that by saving money on infrastructure projects, it meant that there was more money in the contingency bucket that could be used for poverty eradication, sanitation services in communities that really need it. So it was quite an extraordinary experience, and one that I'm very grateful for, and I know that the team in India are still continuing to do some of that work. Another interesting aspect of that trip was the fellow in the middle on the right, if you can see that photograph there. He actually invited me to go to his daughter's wedding, which was quite an honour. And in India, a wedding is quite a ceremony. It's almost like a portfolio of projects that are all happening simultaneously. There's all sorts of rituals and ceremonies and that sort of thing. And as part of the invitation, I had to meet him in Chennai, which was different to Delhi where we were. And because he was so busy organising things with the family and so forth, he asked me that I had to meet him at the hotel at 9 o'clock. That was the only window of opportunity that he had, and he was going to give me a dhoti, the traditional dress, and give me a bit of a rundown as to where I needed to be and when and which ceremonies I was involved in and that sort of thing. So it was quite exciting for me. I got to Chennai in the morning, and of course I had the day to spare, and it's an amazing place with heaps of history, so rather than sort of sit there twiddling my thumbs, I decided to have a look around, and there was a place called Marmalapuram, which has some extraordinary temples that have been carved out of like monolithic rocks. And this is like around 700 AD or something like that. I was just absolutely marvelled at these amazing sculptures that people had done back at that time. Spent a great day doing that, then went back to my driver to catch the vehicle back to meet Siva. And of course, one thing that I learned on the way back is that in India they don't just have a peak hour, they have a 3-hour period of peak hour, and the traffic was really starting to build up on the way back. I started to get quite worried that we weren't going to make it. The traffic just started to increase, and it was just like a continuous orchestra of noise with very, very slow progress. And it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to make it back to meet Siva, and I couldn't believe it. So I wound up talking to the driver about it, and he suggested to me that he was going to drop me, if he dropped me off over the road from the hotel, we could save 20 minutes, which meant I would get there at 10 to 9, which for me was fantastic, good. Yeah, I said, that's a good deal, let's do that. So of course he dropped me off over the road, and I had a look at the hotel, which was right in front of me, and there was 2 lanes of traffic heading this way, and there was 2 lanes of traffic on the other side of the road. The problem was that the 2 lanes of traffic on either side had, between 3 and 5 vehicles abreast on each side, and they were just travelling continuously. So I sort of stopped and thought, okay, I'll just wait until there's a gap. I stood and waited, there was no gap. And I was beating myself. I was thinking, oh, you idiot. I had one thing to do for the whole day, and somehow I managed to stuff it up. You self-indulgent, whatever, running off. So I stood there waiting for this thing. My brain just could not come up with any solution for how to get across this damn road that was between me and the hotel. And then something amazing happened that fixed that problem for me, and I'll tell you about that at the end of the presentation. So I guess one of the other things that the meeting with the minister, it really helped connect me with things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So rather than just doing an engineering project and trying to do it well, which is pretty satisfying in itself, all of a sudden it sort of connected with all of these other aspects that I hadn't really thought of doing projects in Australia. So things like, poverty eradication, improving hunger, health and nutrition and things like that for people, because all of this is all connected with the way people live. So when looking at that, it's good to think about why we actually have project controls, particularly on transportation projects. And at the end of the day, it really is about making sure that communities are getting benefit. Right? So as well as getting the job done, planning it out and delivering it on time, at the end of the day, you want those benefits to go to the community. And the 2 ways to do that is by doing the right projects, so selecting the right ones, so assurance processes and business cases, and of course doing the projects right, which is more about having good, effective planning and project controls in place. Transparency of reporting and project controls. So what is happening now? So this photo here is Peter, who was my Uber driver yesterday in Melbourne. And normally Uber drivers are pretty nice, but this guy just went on a complete rant about the traffic in Melbourne, in particular through the CBD, and explained to me in great detail how what used to be a 15-minute trip now takes well over an hour, and he said it's getting worse and worse. And so I had a look at the map on RACV. I must admit I was a little bit surprised at the amount of disruptions in the road network. So certainly the end users, or this end user, only a sample size of one, so I don't know if I could rely too much on it, but he was absolutely irate just at the amount of time it's taking him to get in and around the city. On a bit of a higher level, the Grattan Institute did a report late 2015, early 2016 on cost blowouts on infrastructure projects, and they shone a very strong light on the inadequate business cases, and in some cases business cases that weren't even prepared before announcements were made, which was causing a very, very, very strong impact on the cost blowouts. In other words, commitments were being made that were false. They weren't backed up by cost engineering or estimating. And of course, naturally, that lie would wind up coming out with cost blowouts and things like that, which really, even though in Australia it's not quite as vital as it might be in a place like India, it's still important. It still means that money's going somewhere where it might have otherwise been used for removing black spots or something else. Grattan Institute also did another report that looked at the discount rates that are used and how inappropriate they are. And what that really means is the rates that were getting used artificially looked for short-term benefit but really didn't think of long-term benefit, which is really not a good thing that we want either. More recently, this was just in the last couple of months, the Australian infrastructure audit came out and it highlighted that the infrastructure projects that we have at the moment are unsustainable from a maintenance perspective. So in terms of we're not able to maintain our existing roads and bridges, and yet we're investing. So once again, it highlighted that there's a problem with the business cases, the costs versus the benefits versus the estimates that are being put forward, that we're not somehow considering that overall life cycle cost. And then lastly, last month, there was another report that came out, and this one was from the Climate Transparency Group, who look at commitments that the government has made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to transition to emission-free transport and some of these sorts of things. And it rates countries, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but basically green is good, brown is bad, and that's Australia featuring in the bad department in terms of phasing out fossil fuel cars. So we're there with Indonesia and Brazil. In terms of doing the same thing for heavy vehicles, once again, Australia is in the brown area. And in terms of a modal shift in ground transport, either to trains or to electric vehicles, once again, Australia is bottom of the list with Russia. And what this is it's kind of a warning that both from the estimating and the project control side, as well as even the environmental side, Australia is just doing something that doesn't seem right. And certainly for me, from my experience actually being inside projects, transportation projects in particular, it did seem that things weren't quite right, and often there was something of a political agenda. This is some data that's quite interesting. This came out of the Grattan Institute report. So it's looking at cost estimates that are done for some of our major projects recently. Inland Rail, for example, the Melbourne Metro. And what it's doing is looking at the gap between P50s and P90s. Are you familiar with P50s and P90s, the terminology? Okay, so the idea being that when we look at the risk associated with the project, there's a 90. If we look at the cost or the schedule that we're 90% confident we could achieve, that's referred to as the P90. If we look at the one that we're 50% confident we could achieve, that's the P50. So for a risky project, there's normally quite a healthy gap between where you're 50-50 whether you can make it and when you're 90% confident. So a fairly medium risk project, you'd expect that gap to be around 20%. If this was a concept project that hadn't even been developed, geotech barely done, hadn't even negotiated with landowners, it's going to be a lot more than that, right? But for some reason, some of these projects, there's only, if we look at that last column, the difference, things like the Inland Rail project, there's only a 7% difference. Like that's just mental. It's completely nuts. And this is the government spending $9 billion of public money. So no one has put their eyes over it. I have no idea who is accountable for this type of stuff, but this is what's happening with our major projects. So you can imagine how all this sort of rolls down, and it's no surprise to me that we're sort of at the bottom of the scale on most of the measures. So the consequence of this, of course, we put contingency in projects so that when we do discover how many rail crossings we have, we can use that contingency to put the right protections in place to protect people. So the way that this will play out is that some poor project managers are going to be on a rail line trying to deal with ridiculous cost and schedule pressure, at the same time trying to comply with safety requirements and things like that. So it's really, really not a good situation. So the tip for owners or anybody, any proponent putting in a business case is to do a sense check of the gap between P50 and P90, just as one simple, high school level statistical check that somebody should be able to do. So another one is the actual misuse of statistics. So this is a diagram that sort of shows like a distribution of the spread that you might have of costs or schedule on a project. And often projects are set up using P50, which is actually not what you'd want to use for a budget for a project. The reason being it's below the average. So the average on a project, the average cost or the expected cost from a simulation is higher than a P50, yet for some reason so many of our government agencies establish budgets on a P50 basis, which basically sets them up for failure. I mean, in cricket, you don't look at David Warner's P50 for his score, because that would be quite low. You'd look at his average. But for some reason, when we're doing these mega projects worth billions of dollars, we look at the wrong numbers. It's absolutely nuts. So I don't know what lawyers or accountants or who it is that's coming up with this stuff to get projects through for whatever reason, but it's very clear that some sort of a cost engineering or a risk engineering process at the front end would be very valuable. So another tip for owners or anybody developing a project, don't set a budget on a P50. At least use the mean or the expected value, and then give yourself a bit of buffer. Using P50, you're just going to set yourself up for failure, especially if you have a lot of projects. It's really unlikely to go your way. So yeah, like I said, I don't understand who's accountable for these business cases or how it goes about, but I'd like to think that somehow in the future there should be some sort of an assurance process where engineers or qualified people are having to run their eyes over it or approve it in some way before a politician can use it for whatever their agenda is. So that's this current status. It's not very good, and I'm being very direct just because I think it's something that's worth talking about that doesn't get spoken about very often. But the future actually looks very positive. So it's almost like we've gone from an era of ignorance and political agenda to, I think now that we're going to transition to an era of technological enlightenment. So we're seeing this impact pretty much every industry, starting to impact construction, but I think transportation, it's really going to make a significant difference. I mean, just think of the days where you'd use your Melways to go from A to B and you'd be sticking your fingers between pages and things like that versus Google Maps now. That's what we're doing as consumers. Imagine once government and everybody else starts getting on board with supporting this type of technology. So of course, autonomous vehicles or at least driver assist vehicles are really making a huge impact. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they develop as well. Unfortunately, Australia is a long way behind, once again, the rest of the world where they're going with it. But if it could be better supported, certainly industry is interested in it, but if it could be better supported at a government level, there could be plenty of opportunities there as well. The unique thing, and the other interesting thing is there's countries like Japan who are world leaders. So even though we might be behind in things like electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, by partnering with countries like that, you can imagine what we might be capable of. And another interesting aspect of that is in Australia we have lots of regional cities that are quite well isolated from the capital cities. So you can imagine how great it would be to, for example, run trials and experiments of things like autonomous vehicles in some of these smaller cities, at the same time upgrade their roads and their facilities, upgrade their line markings, upgrade their signage, which is an uplift for the city, develop and test some technology and then possibly deploy that for benefits in congested cities. The missing ingredient for that is government support. So there is no vision from government at the moment for applying some of these technologies. At the moment the approach is build another road. We're going to spend 100 billion in the next 10 years, all this sort of stuff, but no actual strategic insight or no vision for how mobility and technology might work in the future. So some of the benefits that, there's a great report from Infrastructure Victoria that is actually a world-leading report looking at electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles and what the benefits would be if you were to do a business case for them generally. And there was quite a wide range of possible outcomes, but they were looking at up to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions removed, up to 375 million worth of health benefits just from the reduction in other pollutants in the atmosphere, up to 14.9 billion in increased state domestic product. So that's just from the improved efficiency, so that you're not spending that extra hour trying to get through the CBD and that sort of thing every day. 94% less road accident, or 94% reduction in road accidents. So once again, this is once we get to a mature state in using these type of vehicles. and up to 50% less operating costs on the vehicles. So it's the most unbelievably huge potential benefit if we start dabbling with it and if we start moving towards that type of technology. So the costs were estimated as about $1.7 billion to upgrade the networks, about $2.5 million for upgrading line markings and signage. So these vehicles are actually able to read signs as well. And about $2.2 billion for energy network upgrades so that electric charging can happen. So that's the analysis that was done just looking at electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, just by starting to make that transition. There's another engineer who's based in Sydney, I think, who's also, what's his name? Hussein Dyer, who's also looking at a variety of other technology solutions to our road networks. So things like adaptive traffic signal control, which is about having signalling that's adaptive, that can read the number, that has sensors to read the number of vehicles and can automatically optimise the traffic signalling to optimise the flow through it. So there's all sorts of techniques like this, as well as real-time traffic information and a variety of other software interventions that I don't know the actual technical basis behind it, but all I know is this is technical innovation trying to break into a market, but doesn't seem to be landing anywhere with our government for some reason. So the benefit to cost ratios of a typical good project are normally 3 to 1. In other words, for every $1 we spend, there's $3 of benefit for the community. That's a pretty typical infrastructure project. Things like these technology projects, the first one is a 40 to 1 benefit to cost ratio, yet for some reason we're not doing it because it's new, because it's uncertain or something like that. And then the rest of them all taper down to the bottom, where the traditional one, which is a ratio of about 3 to 1. Things like Melbourne Metro, for example, 1.1 to 1. So barely gets there, billions of dollars invested in it, and maybe some small amounts could be invested in some of these things. So I think part of the problem is navigating through the uncertainty. So, sometimes we don't like doing things that are risky, that haven't been done before. As I mentioned, here in Melbourne, there was a conference involving the Japanese just last week, which was really insightful, looking at autonomous vehicles. And in terms of navigating through the uncertainty, they had their Ministry for Economy, Trade and Industry, and they described it, this is the translated version that I got, was that what their leaders do is they get consensus on a future image, so they imagine how their traffic will flow in the future. Then they get collaborators in to come and collaborate and test it and to make it happen. So they do the collaboration, the future vision, collaborate, and then they test it and trial it, almost like a new bit of software or something like that. And the 3 pillars they described, that it depends on our technology development, infrastructure, and improvement of social acceptance. So they have their government working on the infrastructure, helping make it socially acceptable for people so that people adapt. And it's quite interesting because this is very similar to the infrastructure audit that I mentioned earlier. They described a need to go away from the traditional piecemeal project. So instead of bolting on another road every time there's a congestion problem, they described a process of having a system level view and visioning and validating, which is very similar to the Japanese model, interesting, where you come up with a vision for how it might work, test it, trial it, it might succeed, it might not, and then look at starting to implement it in congested cities. So this is another slide that's quite interesting. You might have seen this before. This is showing the increasing uptake or acceptance of different technologies and how it's starting to escalate. So starting off with things like the mechanical loom and the production line, which from when they were incepted took about up to 100 years, between 150 years, to be fully accepted and adopted within society. These days it's escalating, and most recently WeChat, which is a Chinese app, was introduced in China. Its mobile payment users reached 200 trillion total transactions and surpassed 8 billion in 2017. So within a 4-year time frame, the adoption. So the point being that change is happening more and more rapidly. So there has never been a time in history that change is happening more rapidly than it is now. And right now is the slowest it's ever going to be from now in the future. In other words, it's just going to keep on escalating. And the reason that's interesting is because our ability to learn and adapt actually starts to decrease as we age. Right? So this shows over time, so somebody like me, I'm well past it, so my ability to adapt and to pick up all these new WeChats and technologies is obviously going to be a lot slower than somebody who's younger. So I think a lot more, I think getting that diversity, getting younger people into the mix who might be in some of these groups who are making these decisions, who can absorb all this new information about new technology, might be something worth thinking about. So all this stuff is all very sort of high level government stuff, assurance on projects. What does this mean for project controls, particularly on transport projects, which have traditionally been road and rail? So firstly, it means there's going to be a greater focus on risk. All of this technology, no one knows how it's going to play out. No one's done it before. There's no guidebook or wizard that's going to help you when you go to do it. We have to learn by trial and error, taking a risk-based approach. So it's more of an agile approach as well. So, particularly roads have traditionally been, EPC style. All of a sudden, we're going to need to start considering agile approaches to all sorts of different problems, including transport problems. Competencies, I think, is a really important one. So those business cases and those estimates that I showed before with the P50s and the P90s for $9 billion that are like that, obviously there's not competent people involved. So to have competencies for risk and cost engineering, I think is fundamentally important. So whoever's putting the numbers on that sheet has to show that they're competent in some way or something like that. And the other one being continuous learning. So whatever all of the innovations are and the new techniques that I had on my slides earlier, there'll be a completely new list of those within 2 years' time or 5 years' time. And most of what I had on there will possibly be redundant. So it's continuous learning and continuous evolving. So as I mentioned, competency and capability. So risk analysis is the key one. And it was really interesting hearing Nick Stanton reinforce that during the keynote presentation as well. People and change management, which is what Luke was talking about, the whole idea that you have all of this new change. How do you get people to change? All of these people who are approving these projects, how do you get them to think differently and open up to different ways of doing things? More of a systems thinking approach. So instead of bolting on a new road every single time there's a congestion problem, how can we look at the overall system? What sort of smart infrastructure might be able to be implemented that can just help everything coordinate better? Instead of relying on users, every single user, to try and optimise their own path using Google Maps or whatever, it might be a bit more effective overall if there's some smart infrastructure built up that looks at the overall system. And the last competency is like software development cycles. So more and more traditional projects that have been done by design, procure, construct are now starting to take this agile approach where we do something, try it, test it, see if it works, go back, start again. Oh, it does work, go further. So a different kind of project methodology as well, which means if we're planning, we're scheduling, we're dealing with people, we need to take a different approach too. And continuous micro-learning. So instead of big courses, big degrees, I think people are going to be continuously updating their skills with sort of more microscopic style courses. So in summary, so looking at this in terms of the people and the data, I think understanding people's values. So do we care about safety? Do we care about the environment? Do we care about whether the right numbers are going into the business case? All of those values are going to be something that we're always working with people on those to understand what needs to be measured. Understanding what the criteria is, so there's always going to be people involved in that, understanding what matters that needs to be measured. I think the monitoring, I think a lot more models and technology are going to be used for that in the future, and feedback loops are going to become more and more automated, and they already are, a lot of the standard sort of project controls reporting, but I can see that just continuing to happen more and more to the point that AI, machine learning and some of these sorts of things, the more projects we have, particularly repeat projects like transport projects, I think AI is going to start taking over for a lot of the functions that we've done. So in summary, I've dumped a lot of stuff on you there, like from the very high level crazy stuff that's happening in government to the need to have good project controls professionals looking at those business cases and sense checking the numbers, right down to some of the more agile type change management processes that we have on projects. What I'd like to leave you with is just things to think about, because I don't know, I'm not an expert on transport. I've done a lot of risk and project controls, but to me transport just looks like it's ready to have a fresh approach. So what if the business cases and assurance processes were done properly, so instead of whatever that process is at the moment? What if a qualified or a competent risk engineer or a cost engineer or a project control professional had involvement in some way to sign off and go, yeah, that kind of looks right? And then lastly, what if smart transport solutions were given a higher priority? So I've heard in the last week, I've heard the federal government say 100 billion in the next 10 years, but say nothing about technology, all about sort of infrastructure projects. I've heard the Victorian Treasurer say a really high amount. I think it was 7.8 billion a year or something like that over the next 10 years. So ridiculous billions, all on concrete and asphalt and all this stuff. What is happening in the tech? What might happen? What might Australia be able to do if we can experiment with that, partner with the Japanese or whatever, and maybe come up with a smarter way of doing something that's less disruptive, leaves less footprint for the environment. Oh, sorry. So lastly, to my story in India, where I was going to the wedding, and I was stuck there, just standing there, absolutely furious with myself, and no way of contacting Siva because the traffic was just so loud. And then out of the blue, I got a tap on the shoulder, and this young Indian guy comes up to me with a big smile and goes, "You're never going to get across that road. I've been watching you." And I said, "Correct." And he reached out and grabbed my hand like that. I've never had a man hold my hand like that before. And he just started walking. We just started walking straight out into the traffic. And of course, to my surprise, all of the traffic just sort of found its way around, just like fish going around a piece of coral. There was no road rage. There was no screeching of the brakes or anything like that. We just walked straight across. I just couldn't believe how easy it was. But on reflection, why I find that interesting is it's amazing how sometimes when you're set in your ways, you've got your own way of doing things and things like that. Sometimes when you're in a different environment where the culture's different, there can be a really easy solution to things if you just let somebody else sort of come in and help you. So that's all. So any questions?
I am Sama from ICOM. Thank you for your good speech. You gave some numbers about the difference between P50 and P90 on a medium risk project. So do you have any idea about low risk and high risk project? What the difference between P50 and P90 figures of the cost estimate?
There's a cost estimate classification system by AAC International. It's generic based on process industry projects. More complex projects, so things like software projects will be wider than that, but I'll share that reference with you. I can't say off the top of my head, but generally, the earlier in the concept stage you are, the wider the gap. And these projects that I showed you were in concept stage, so plus 70%, minus 30, something like that, and then it tapers back as you go there. So I'll share that resource with you, but it's just a guide to show you the concept. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Yeah, actually I have a doubt for the maintenance in regards to sustainable maintenance. So as you said, as of now, Victoria doesn't have the sustainable maintenance for the transportation and road system. So what's your take for the sustainable maintenance? Like in terms of in the future, are they going to adapt for the 3D printers or with the, the polymer concrete? So what would be the take for especially for the transportation systems, for the rails?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand the question. I've got a feeling I can't answer it as well. So I'm not a transportation expert.
Especially as of now, we have that 3D printers for the technology for the fourth industrial revolution. So how if we adapt the 3D printers for the maintenance, for the preventive maintenance and for the regular replacement maintenance, that way we can make the infrastructure much more sustainable than what we have now.
So I think you said 3D printers?
Yes.
Yes, I don't understand that technology very much. But the takeaway for me is that if we invest in these autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, what we do is we upgrade the roads, which is road maintenance, which is what the infrastructure report is saying we need more of. So maybe if those hundreds of billions, instead of all being, if some of those were invested towards electric charging stations and upgrading existing roads, preparing them for autonomous vehicles, that maintenance would be getting performed naturally. Plus, we'd be creating a test bed and an environment that's going to be more conducive to people who want electric vehicles, to people who want autonomous vehicles.
So, like from my understanding, to upgrade for the automatic vehicles, we need to upgrade the road as well. So we need a new road and new pavements all along the way.
So the main criteria for autonomous vehicles is signage and line markings. So it's actually quite simple. It's just visual signals for the LiDAR to pick up. So it's really, really simple. So you don't want potholes. You want a well-maintained surface, line markings and signs. It's really simple, which most councils, for example, would welcome that type of thing in their area. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's, I would say, very concerning when you say that the government is doing crazy things. So I wonder why is the statement first, and second, maybe, is there anyone doing something to change that? And why is it happening? Is it a matter of the advisors to the government are not the right people, or they have their own interests, agendas, or something there that as an Australian, I think, or a global citizen anyway, I think it is a bit worrying, because if we are going in the wrong direction and nobody's telling us, like this is a cruise Titanic going this way and it shouldn't be going that way, and nobody's actually trying to make a change direction, that's really concerning.
Yeah, so there are lots of good people who are trying to change it, and these are the people who've taught me about the problem. So a lot of state governments are doing good things. They're doing, so they don't understand what the overall plan is for Australia, so it's difficult for them to understand what standards to apply, what type of charging systems to use, because there's different ones. So they're trying to lead the way, but ideally there would be a vision from the federal government. So I know in Queensland they've done some wonderful things with tourist projects for electric charging. They've started installing. I know in New South Wales they're doing autonomous vehicle trials in a number of different cities. But each state is sort of doing it in isolation the hard way. What would be better if, as a nation, there was a plan or a vision, and it would be sort of coordinated or something like that. So most of this I've picked up from frustrated states who are trying to do it, but not how to do it in sync with the other states or how everyone wants. It's like before Federation, remember Australia had rail gauge, and it was different in each state, and it wound up becoming a real inefficiency. So by having a nice standardisation and a vision for how it should work, it would be a lot more efficient, but at the moment that doesn't seem to quite be happening. Cool, thank you.